Are AMD GPUs in trouble? It looks like Intel is actually catching up. We're not just talking about in performance and drivers. The recent sort of sales numbers puts Intel basically neck and neck in their market position with AMD. Of course, Nvidia is still out there with over, 80% of the market. Even though their market share did drop a little bit, we would have figured that AMD should have caught up a lot more by now. They should have been at like 20, 30% if they focused on the GPU market and didn't leave their prices really high. That's going to be one of the biggest problems. AMD's pricing, regardless of how good their actual products, I even think the 7900 XTX is amazing. I even wrote an article that Lisa Su, the CEO, liked, so that must mean something. I think it's a better value than the 4080, and even though Nvidia, in my opinion, does make the better GPUs as a whole, in general, the 7900 XTX for $999 is a pretty amazing value. But the problem is, Intel is coming in right at the bottom of the market where people aren't really competing nearly as much. And even though AMD has some great GPUs in the entry level, like the 6600 XT and even the 6700 XT, amongst others, I think the problem was the pricing was just way too high until recently. And Intel, while they know that they're going to have a hard time going up against Nvidia, I think they first set their sights on AMD, which is going to be a much smaller competition. While Nvidia is going to be like the last boss, I think they might do a pretty good job at really disrupting AMD's GPU business because look, the Intel Arc GPUs, yes, when they initially came out, they do have a lot of driver problems. They're not very stable. They're lackluster in many ways. They don't have anything high end to even compete with like a 6900 XT and above or anything like that. But what they do have is definitely a lot of manufacturing power. They do have a lot of GPUs out there with integrated graphics. And now that Arc is sort of really starting to come into fruition a little bit better, maybe with things like ray tracing and having better performance for the price, they're definitely taking some of that market share away. I mean, the numbers don't really lie. While I still think that today you're going to have a better experience on an AMD GPU like a 6600 XT than something like an Intel Arc. And now let's hear a word from our sponsor, VIP-CDKdeals.com, a Windows 10 Pro CD key. Add to cart, you put in code CC20. This will also work on Windows 11. You want to go into your settings in Windows, change and adjust your CD key, click activate, and now let's go back to the video. You do have to give credit where credit is due. They're catching up quickly. Even their new driver updates, DX9 games improved tremendously. It seems like with every driver update, a couple of things are at least improving in a very dramatic fashion. And AMD, while their drivers are definitely much more stable in general than Intel, they had some troubles as well recently. I mean, remember after the 7000 series were updated with recent game releases, that was all fine. But then the RX 6000, even up to like the 6950 XT, which is a fairly new GPU, that one took a few months more for those drivers to be updated, worrying many users that maybe the last generation AMD's not really paying that much attention to. Therefore, as Intel definitely is doing a really, really hard work on these drivers, they're starting to catch up, and these numbers really don't lie. I mean, Intel isn't some startup company. Just because they're starting to focus on GPUs doesn't mean they're a little company that they don't know what they're doing necessarily. They're a massive, massive company. So if they're getting into the GPU landscape, it's certainly something to be worried about. I know sometimes people will defend Intel like, oh, we need a third player in the competition with AMD and Nvidia. Poor little guys, they're just sort of the underdog. I don't really view it that way. They're a massive corporation. They're much bigger in terms of revenue than most other companies out there. So the only difference here is they're new to the GPU game, which is a very difficult market. And of course, they deserve some credit for trying to break in, but I wouldn't still really underestimate them or even overestimate them. Just look at it as how it is. Either they can get the job done or not. But in the meantime, they're definitely taking market share from AMD, and AMD definitely has to smarten up not only with their products, but with the marketing as well. Remember when RX 7000 came out, they have so many little issues with not only with the drivers having some issues, but with the cooler on the reference 7900 XTX. That happens with many people, but their response was a little funny. They took a little while to really engage with the community. So they definitely have some things in the marketing and in the customer service area that were a little bit lacking. Nvidia, for whatever people say about the business practices and the pricing, they definitely put out the best products. You can't really argue. That's why they have a dominant market share. So AMD is going to have to really please the customers a lot more if they're going to compete with Intel, because Intel's really trying. They're pricing their GPUs lower than a lot of their competitors. They're trying to put in features like ray tracing, and they even have upscaling that's going to compete with FSR and DLSS. And of course, they're really working hard on the drivers to make sure that it's more stable and it works. They take the eye off the ball, AMD that is, Intel could surpass them before we know it, even as early as within the next quarter or two. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But AMD is definitely in trouble. Not only are they fighting Nvidia on one end, they also now have Intel chasing them down. And Intel seems like they really want to make sure that this GPU thing works out. All right, guys, let me know what you think down below. You really think AMD could get squished in between Intel and Nvidia? Could Intel eventually fight Nvidia for GPU market share? Is that something we're going to see within the next few years? Very interesting indeed. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.